Coming up, it is officially the 2024 offseason for the New York Football Giants, and the question stands, is this Joe Schoen's time to shine, or are we potentially concerned about the GM at the helm in a critical year 3? We dive in on all the past successes and failures coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant podcast where you know that we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andy Makowitz. We let you know this episode is brought to you by Manscaped. You can go to manscaped.com and use our exclusive promo code OGP24 for a 20% off discount and free shipping on your order. More about them later on, Andy. As you know, as I know, as we all know, it's Valentine's Day, and that's a time to spend a little bit of romantic, special time, dedicated time with your significant other. And that's why Andy and I are doing a podcast. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I mean, we got to get the podcast out of the way. That's what true love is. You let the other person go, do the things that you need to do. And Adam, there is, this adoration that I have for you.
Yeah.
Happy Valentine's Day, my friend.
Dude, that's what it's about, man. Cards in the mail. Don't worry about it. You're definitely going to see that card coming through. Obviously, we have some other things planned. Don't worry, Courtney, Kelly. It's it's all in the works and well taken care of. We do come in, though. Obviously, Super Bowl is out of the way. Giants were not involved, in case anyone's wondering, but they do have a critical offseason coming up here. And this journey started for me, Andy, by throwing a poll up over on Twitter where I asked, how confident is the Giants fan base in Joe Schoen entering the first offseason with real cap space to spend in free agency? I gave the options. In Joe Schoen, we trust, right? Shane's about to cook here. Cautiously optimistic, or he's paying Daniel Jones $47 million. How dare he? The numbers across the board here were fairly balanced, with, by the way, Schoen is about to cook, coming in at the lowest rank, 25%. Just right off the top here, before we really go through, and as we always say, looking back, you get a little bit better sense in year 2 and going towards year 3. Do you feel bullish on Joe Schoen entering this offseason?
Yeah, it's a good question, Adam. After the Giants make the playoffs in his first season with Brian Daboll as the head coach,
it's all wine and roses,
wins the
baby.
playoff game with Daniel Jones, you're like, man, now think about what he could do with another offseason. And maybe he had too much time in that offseason to be able to retool this team, because it felt like it really fell apart. And it's very difficult for me to really put all the blame on Joe Schoen. Now, I think there's a mixed bag of certain trades that have happened, draft picks and otherwise, that maybe, you could say were good or bad, Adam. But ultimately, it just feels like you had a really solid year 1. Year 2 fell apart for a whole host of reasons, a lot of it having to do with injuries. So I'm kind of okay letting year 3 be more indicative of which one is more appropriate to judge Joe Schoen on.
Yeah, and I think that's the fair way to do it. And I wanted to go dial it back all the way to 2022 first and then walk it up, because I think it does kind of paint a bit of a picture. And one part of that is obviously going to be the draft class. But in 2022, with very limited cap space, remember, cleared off some of the ugly money that was on the books for the Giants coming out of the Gettleman era, Joe Schoen went out and added Tyrod Taylor, veteran quarterback, running back Matt Breida, Ricky Seals-Jones, might have forgotten about that one. Jordan Akins also added Mark Glowinski. That was the big spend that he had there in the offseason with not a lot to work with. Also had Max Garcia, Matt Gano, and John Feliciano brought in through free agency. Before we hit the draft class, when you look back at that, again, limited money to work with. But I right off the top go, why is Matt Breida here? Never gets used over 2 years. Not going to be back on this roster. Ricky Seals-Jones, listen, you want to say it's a flyer, right? You bring in a couple of guys at the tight end position, and then you go into that guard room. We understand that it's been a mixed bag at best when it comes to Glowinski, and the other names that are on that list, while Feliciano came in and was a nice stopgap, did not return to this team the following year through free agency. So you had 4 signings in the offseason, 4 allocation of your very limited cap space to players that do not exist and will not exist in the terms of Glowinski potentially here coming out of this offseason now.
Yeah, it felt like there was limited cap space to do anything. And it felt like, and also nothing got accomplished, right? You were hoping that maybe a veteran like Glowinski, the one that got the multi-year deal, the one that Joe Schoen wanted to address the offensive line would be like, well, at least we addressed this with our first priority. And
Right.
it's tough because you give Joe Schoen credit for allocating the funds towards the offensive line, but did he allocate it towards the right person? As we've seen, Mark Glowinski struggled when he was in Seattle. Then he went to the Indianapolis Colts and played on one of the best offensive lines for years and years next to Quentin Nelson and others on that offensive line that
Right.
maybe made him look a little bit better than he has been. And he really has had not, I would say, not as successful of a run with the Giants as we would like him to be, considering he was a free agent signing and he was, basically benched during his second year with the team. So for me, all the other guys are veteran minimum signings. You're trying, you're using guys like Matt Breida, who you have familiarity with from Buffalo, John Feliciano, who you have familiarity with. You're trying to draw on the players that you know what they are, a known commodity, with the limited resources you have. I'm kind of okay with those signings considering the limited funds you put towards them. But overall, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel like that was a very uninspiring free agent pool that came in and had limited contributions to the team.
Yeah, again, like the Tyrod Taylor is a hit for me. People are going to say, what is he supposed to be, or whatever the case is. He's a veteran quarterback, had experience in the system, connections with Brian Dable, obviously. But to your point, same thing with John Feliciano. So that's a success, right? But after that, like you say, limited money, and I'm not going to sit here and scrutinize back end roster players. But if you only have so much money, sometimes it's better to make sure you get that one home run hit, something we'll talk about when we fast forward to the 2023 offseason. Then you have the draft class. And what's nice about this is we're entering year number 3. And even after 2 years, you can look back at this draft class a little bit differently. So Kayvon Thibodeau, obviously a success story, top end of the draft there. You expect it to be such. Still a massive question mark on Evan Neal. Can make a very strong case that he is going to be a nightmare bust for the Joe Schoen regime. Then you get to Wan'Dale Robinson, and I'll also add in Azudu, Cordell Flott, Daniel Bellinger, Dane Belton, Micah McFadden, DJ Davidson, and also Marcus McCathan. That was the draft class for 2022. Why I said stop on Wan'Dale Robinson? Well, if we had this conversation after last year, which we almost certainly did, it would have been, boy, injury concerns, couldn't really stay healthy. Is he going to be a player that can be productive? You go look at him now. Andy, he's top, I think, 4 in players to have over 50 receptions in the NFL this past season and have, from a catch percentage standpoint, locked in at 70. Doesn't want to get the number wrong, but he's lost it, 6.9% catch percentage. He is among the best in the league this past season in bringing in those balls when they come his way. 78 targets, 60 catches, converted it to 525 yards, obviously only the 1 touchdown. But he flipped from being a real question mark to being a real bright spot and success. Likewise, maybe Daniel Bellinger went from being, oh man, a real bright spot, real steal, to, oh, took a little bit of a back seat, didn't really have the same type of step forward in year number 2. How do you look at the draft class now that you have a 2-year sample size on them?
Well, let's start with the most draft capital spent and work our way down. And I won't go ad nauseum through here, but
Sure.
I'll very briefly say I feel confident that Kayvon Thibodeau is a game-changing edge rusher who can make big plays for the Giants.
Mm-hmm.
That to me, he's shown the progression. Double-digit sacks. He looks like he's all over the field when they ask him to rush the quarterback. You hope under the new defensive scheme that they utilize him effectively and not have him drop back in coverages like he kind of was claiming that Wink had him doing with all these crazy blitz schemes that Wink did. Evan Neal hurts. It hurts. But the reason why it hurts is because, before the pick before Evan Neal was Ike Ekwonu, who went to the Carolina Panthers, right? He had a 62 and a 65 Pro Football Focus grade. Okay, not spectacular, but not like you're going to replace him anytime soon. And then you had Charles Cross, who went 9th to the Seattle Seahawks. They were all in the discussion with Evan Neal around what they were going to go to. And you look at Charles Cross, he had 62 Pro Football Focus, 67. So they're in the 60s when it comes to that. Evan Neal in 2022, his first season was a 44. And then in 23, where you expect him to rise, he was a 39.
Just
It
setting the
is
baseline.
so painful to know that of the 3 top 10 offensive tackles that went, we ended up getting surefire, the one that has had the least production and you feel the worst about right now. And you and I both agreed that we wanted Evan Neal. So it's not necessarily a knock on Joe Schoen specifically that his talent evaluation is way far off from what we've seen too. It's
Mm.
just really unfortunate that you have 2 top 10 picks, a chance to transform your organization for years to come. You feel like you hit on one, but man, did you whiff on the other, right?
Oh, 100%. And by the way, this goes into so the perspective on Joe Schoen of remember, this was the classic draft with a classic line. Scared money don't make money. Am I right, Bry? Hey, pew, 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 pew. And then he says, we'll take it. We'll take Thibodeau, at 5, and we'll be happy with anyone at 7. Now, again, Thibodeau is a massive success. So you have to give credit for that because you're obviously confident in that pick. But being willing to say, and we'll just take whatever, well, then that goes into talent evaluation and understanding where are we in terms of the pecking order of right tackles that we're going to be bringing in here and whether or not we could be looking another direction after year 3 and arguably maybe after year 2, depending on how this offseason goes. So it's funny. I mentioned Wan'Dale Robinson being a hit. Micah McFadden is a big leap forward here, right? Takes a huge step in year number 2 in a way that, again, later round pick. So this actually could be a late find for them. All of the players on the front, Zudu, McCathan, wait and see. Not sure what they're going to be for this team. But in the end, if we look back at 2022, it's hard for me to give. I want to give his draft grade like a B minus because there are hits coming out of it. The miss at the top here could be so egregious that like it cannot be anything better than say a C plus, knowing that you're going to have some productive players. I'm going to go with C plus, which I think is being generous on the draft. And I'm going to say off-season C minus because ultimately you got a veteran backup. I mean, maybe that should be even lower, but it's not like you did a lot, again, giving real leeway for not having a lot to work with from a cap standpoint. Where do you grade out?
Yeah, I'm pretty close to you, Adam. And the one that you kind of glossed over that really frustrates me is Joshua Zudu.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
Adam,
yeah, because
we
they
spent this
went to get that guy. That was we believe in this kid.
he was the 67th pick. Like that is still a high contributing starter across any metric in the
Yeah.
NFL, right? And we don't even know if he can get on the field, whether or not he can stay healthy, whether or not he can play tackle or guard. Like there's so many question marks after 2 years with the Zudu that it really pains me to think that Joe Schoen had 4 picks in the top 67, and 2 of them look like they may not be contributing starters long term. That to me
You
is
know
the
what?
hard part.
Yeah.
You mentioned Micah McFadden taking a big step. That is huge to find someone towards the back end of the draft being able to be a starter. You mentioned Cordell Flott. Looks like he may be able to be a starter in nickel packages.
Hmm. Hmm.
Looks like he's coming along. But then, I'm not going to hold anything against Joe Schoen for guys like Darian Beavers and Marcus McCathan when you're talking about the 150th pick
Of
plus.
course.
But to me, missing on 50% of your top 65, 70 picks, you can't have a B rating. It has to be in the C's, even though you hope to think that Kayvon Thibodeau could be a great, the best of the bunch of all of them.
And you're right, because even though finding some late round gems is nice, you're still graded on the top talent because that's where the best players are. And that's where your hits have to come, right? You got to bat 75% in the top half of your draft. And then if you go 50-50 in the back, and it's like, great, we'll find some guys that can be some contributors. So in the end, I end up downgrading to a C for the draft, and I end up going D plus for the offseason because when I went back and looked at it again, I'm like, what are we doing here? Glowinski's a mess. There's nobody. I mean, again, you had a veteran quarterback. Guess what? You probably could have thrown a rock and hit a veteran quarterback in the head. We'll actually talk about that later in the week with some news out of Pittsburgh and one Mitchell Trubisky. That being the case, coming up here, we got to get into the 2023 draft class, the 2023 offseason. And if we think, as Joe Schoen is getting some financial stability back, are we seeing the footprints of where he can be successful? Before we do that, though, friends, got to tell you that this show is brought to you by Manscaped. Using our exclusive code OGP24, you can get 20% off your order and free shipping at manscaped.com. But more than that, 2024 is in full swing, and that means it's time for a New Year's resolution. Check in with our friends at Manscaped. It's never too late to level up your grooming game and keep yourself nice, brushed, trimmed, and tamed. Manscaped's new Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra is every man's cheat code to look good, feel good, and turn the page on confidence this year. Whether you're going for a trim or that clean shave look, this trimmer has you covered, trusted by over 10 million men worldwide. Now it is your time to get a grip on your grooming with our exclusive offer. As I said, go to manscaped.com. Excuse me. So excited about this. Why? Because it's 20% off with our promo code OGP24 and free shipping. The ball is dropped. but don't drop the ball on your balls. Andy, how are we doing on our New Year's resolutions? Are you holding fast and true to all those great proclamations for the year?
Yeah, one of them was to just not talk about Daniel Jones in a positive or negative light until
Here
he
we go.
gets back on the field, so we can see what it actually is. So I feel like we've been doing pretty good. It's very difficult doing that on the podcast, but here we are.
You may have noticed too that look at me. Ever since our Manscaped became a sponsor, I look a little bit more groomed, don't I? Something's turning for me. It may be the 2024 resolution to not look like a disheveled bum. That is because you have not only all those great products we mentioned at the top, but also the MVP of 2024, Manscaped's 5th generation lawnmower, not just a trimmer, it's a groomer sidekick, equipped with 2 skin-safe blade heads, a standard one for taking a little bit off the top, and a new foil blade to go smooth wherever your heart desires. And by the way, for all those men out there, make your ladies happy. It's still Valentine's Day, even though it's 2024. You want that full grooming experience? Look no further than Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0. It's a grooming kit that you can trust with the lawnmower, the Manscaped ear and nose hair trimmer, and the essential aftercare products with a crop smoother, ball aftershave lotion, don't mind if I do, and a crop preserver, also anti-chafing ball deodorant. Oh, guys, let's face it, resolutions may come and go, but well-groomed, can be here to stay thanks to Manscaped. Get 20% off and free shipping with our exclusive promo code OGP24 at manscaped.com. Embrace a new you and definitely embrace a new trimmer courtesy of Manscaped. I like to go baritone at the end of that, Manscaped, because it makes me feel like maybe I'm more of a man if I do that. It also makes me feel like more of a man when I keep a beard. I don't know. I'm getting off track here, Andy. The bottom line is turn our attention over to 2023, where I wasn't a man yet, but in 24, I really came into my own. The Giants and Joe Schoen, they said in 2023 offseason, we're going to add some talent to this team. We're going to bring some stability, both sides of the football. They add, this is a bad way to start, top of the list. Wide receiver Paris Campbell, wide receiver Jamison Crowder, wide receiver Jeff Smith, tight end Darren Waller via trade, 3rd round pick that they got from 2-time Super Bowl champion Kadarius Toney going to the Kansas City Chiefs, tight end Tommy Sweeney. You had Robinson at defensive tackle. You also have Nunez Roche, Bobby Okereke, a linebacker, double asterisk underline. Also Aquari in the cornerback position and Bobby McCain. Point stop. Do we feel, I think I do, better about this offseason in 2023 than we did in 2022?
Only marginally, Adam.
Ooh,
And
okay.
and and we look at the hits. Obviously, Bobby Okereke was a hit. He is the heart and soul of that defense. He played unbelievable. He exceeded any expectations I had for him on the field. One hundred
And you
percent.
love this compared to the only big expenditure from the year prior was Glowinski. So if you're going to spend the money, make it be a real success. So it's good that he did do that this year.
Exactly. So right there, I sit there and say the number one most annual value contracts that you're giving out is to a guy that is not only a contributor, but my favorite phrase, a force multiplier
Ooh,
on
okay.
that defense, where he was all over the field, forcing turnovers, interceptions, tip balls, tackles. Like he felt like the steady Eddie in the middle of the field
Mhm.
for the Giants. And so I really appreciate Bobby Okereke. The reason why I say marginally is because we we thought that Mike Kafka and Brian Daboll had this idea with Joe Schoen on how they want the offense to look. And so they go out and they spend $4 million on Paris Campbell, being like, he's often injured, but like he has this speed and they're just not utilizing him effectively in Indianapolis. And like a funny thing happened because like 3 games in, they basically benched him and
Yeah.
said, he actually doesn't work here for what we're trying to do. So they realize they get credit for benching him when they realize it's not working, but they spent $4 million on him, and that was a big whiff. And well, I'll just say one more thing about the
Yeah.
wide receiver room. We needed to wait until Gunnar Olszewski got released by other teams to be able to sort out the special teams. We let Jamison Crowder go for a bag of balls. Literally, just go. Get out of here. We don't need your
Couldn't
services
think of
here.
a reason to keep you.
It got Eric Gray injured. It was a whole. There was fumbles all over the place. Special teams was a mess. So, Adam, when I look at those initial moves right away, I think Bobby Okereke was a hit, but in the wide receiver room, like Paris Campbell was such a miss, and letting Jamison Crowder go feels like a huge error for the Giants that took 15 weeks to correct. I don't know if you feel the same way though.
Well, listen, and we talked about this during the year, right? Once we saw the writing on the wall, the Jameson. So here's why it's like doubly painful, because not only do you bring in Paris Campbell, who turns out to be a whiff. I'll get back to that in a second. But then you also have Jamison Crowder. Just to your point, it wasn't even about as a wide receiver. It was just, hey, we need someone to play special teams for us, be a veteran, experienced player at that position. And it takes you a long time, as you mentioned, to go ahead and find that replacement. Now, if I quickly pull up here in the background, the Jamison Crowder, I wanted to get the stat lines here on him in 2023 because he ends up only playing all 17 games, but only has 16 receptions for 159 yards. Way better than the production you probably got from Paris Campbell. Although at one point I think like he was leading the team, oddly enough, in like catches or something for like 1 or 2 weeks. He was like the leading receiver. It was like 4 catches a week for like 6 yards. It wasn't doing anything of substance. And so it's a problem because you have the guy in the building that solved the problem and you let him walk away. You had another guy in the building that you kept in the building, not unlike Glowinski, it feels like, because you spent money on him and you were convinced that perceptually you could not make a decision to get away from him. Here's why it's even more brutal, because he paid a little over I think it was $4 million, right, on a 1-year deal for Paris Campbell. The year prior, as we mentioned, you let John Feliciano, you brought him in, and then you also let him walk in the 2023 offseason. He went on to play for San Francisco. You had a player in Will Hernandez on this roster that was drafted by a previous regime, and oddly enough, took a while, but rounded himself into decent form. He signed a 2-year, $9 million deal in the offseason, average AAV of 4.5. For a team that desperately needed offensive line stability, this then feels like Joe Schoen saying, well, when you look back at last year, don't worry, these guys are going to get there. And you were willing to take another risk on Glowinski, who ends up not even being the starter at the beginning of the year, 1 year after signing him, when you had a guy. Like, you had probably people in the building that said, this is what this guy is, this is what he can be. He played to a 67 Will Hernandez PFF. He played 1,100 snaps. Now, just to run long here for a second, right behind him in terms of price point, Nate Herberg went from the Jets to the Pittsburgh Steelers. He ended up basically being a backup, right? And he only played like 150 something snaps. But guess what? They were well-rated snaps. So I'm not even sitting here telling you that like all money is created equal. You could have spent that same $4 million on a backup offensive lineman that maybe comes into the fold. When you're a team with holes at those positions, take shots on guys that could impress you and maybe end up being a contributor for you. Paris Campbell at that price, again, it's results oriented, but it's an absolute black stain on that all season because that accounts for a massive different decision that you could have made.
I just can't get over the wide receiver situation. And
I
let me
know,
just
I know.
let me just put this in perspective for you, Adam. Paris Campbell and Sterling Shepard had a combined 2 more yards than Jamison Crowder did, and they were making 5 times the amount of money. And it's like, if you just consolidated Sterling Shepard and Paris Campbell into Jamison Crowder, you not only solved your kick returner problem, you have your back end veteran wide receiver that's there, and you have millions of dollars to go out and spend other places. And it looks like a fatal error if you knew Sterling Shepard was not going to be part of the plan for you. And if you saw very quickly that Paris Campbell wasn't going to be the person, it just feels like a critical mistake the way that they constructed that room, knowing that you had 2 guys that were making 5 times more than Jamison Crowder when he was already in the building. Like it, and that's the tough part. Is it's not like we're saying, oh, there was this free agent that you could have picked up and it was an unknown from another team. They were all in the building together during training camp. Like, you saw what was there available to you, and this was the decision that was made, and it clearly did not work out for the Giants.
Yeah, it ends up coming down to, again, don't throw good money after bad. Yeah, you know what I mean? You get him in the building, okay, if it's not going to work out, it's not going to work out. What's the pivot? And you can double down, by the way. I went and looked at, because Paris Campbell, like you said, was 4.7 million. So it makes it even a little bit worse there, because that's an extra 700,000. No big deal, though. You got that line around for him to come in this offseason. Now, when you look up the board, there's a guy here that jumps out at you. He is 6'3" wide receiver, had a productive year for the Carolina Panthers, but maybe didn't fit the mold. But DJ Shark, he signed a 1-year, $5 million deal with Carolina. I mean, a clearly established receiver. Again, up and down, had some injuries of his own. But as you work your way up the list, Darius Slayton's there on his 2 for 12, 6 million average AAV. But like Robert Woods at 7.6 million. Adam Thielen, I wouldn't have done it, but a 3-year deal, AAV of 8.3. Maybe even a Juju Smith-Schuster, who ended up in Kansas City. If we talked about it in the offseason, we'd say, listen, I don't know if I really want to take a shot on a guy like that. 8.5 million. So to your point, when you talk about throwing around a little extra money here and a little extra money there, I wouldn't have hated if you condense this down a little bit, maybe you don't get Tommy Sweeney, the tight end, or maybe you don't get a player like, I mean, Bobby McCain had his contributions, but consolidate that money and make sure you go out and get two really important guys. Now, again, there's always going to be misses. Nothing is perfect here, right? But when you're limited, you do end up narrowly focusing on it. Nunez Roche, you talk about Robinson. These are quality contributors, smart pickups, right? So this was an offseason that had some nice hits for it. McCain as well, contributing on the defensive side. Let's focus in on the other one. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on the Robinson side, Nunez Roche and Robinson allowed Joe Schoen to trade Leonard Williams and get a second-round pick. So because he did his due diligence with them, he was able to turn that into draft capital. So that's the positive piece of it, where there are contributors, but it just felt like on the offensive line and in the wide receiver room, there's just been so much inconsistency that it makes it hard for you to say outstanding grade, Joe Schoen.
Of course. And then the other big one here for me, and we talked about this, touched on it last episode a little bit, is looking at a player like Darren Waller, right? You convert Kadarius Toney into a third-round pick. Excellent. Compensatory, 100 overall. Then you think you want to bring in an extra weapon here. And this is all predicated on, by the way, having signed Daniel Jones, right, to the extension and believing you're going to continue to build around him. Listen, it makes it look worse when he's kind of injured and doesn't have a productive year and things go off the rails a bit. But from a money standpoint, again, you have limited funds. So to go and get that player, and as we highlighted last episode, a guy that if you chose to cut now in this offseason, which you might viably think is an option, it's going to cost you over $7 million in dead cap to free up 14. So if you rewind this back to the offseason, look out across the landscape and say, where might I better have allocated it? The one thing I'll note about getting Darren Waller, while in the moment we thought, hey, you've converted, right, a nothing in Toney to something potentially. It did have that little wisp of, but why aren't you fixing the thing that matters most, right? And if you're overconfident that your offensive line is going to be good, well, then I have another problem, and that's talent evaluation, right? Because we clearly saw that the offensive line play was not going to be up to par this season, and the Giants ended up spinning their wheels through much of the year, rotating players, guys in and out, shuffling lines, trying to find combinations that could be moderately successful.
You mentioned Darren Waller, and the simple answer here is if the Giants cut him, it was a terrible mistake to trade for him. There's no other way around it. Not only was he injured and not as productive as you'd hope he would be, but also you traded a third-round pick for a one-year rental, and you're adding $7 million of potential dead cap space. So it's twofold. You lose the third-round pick, which could be a contributing starter in the draft, and you're also adding $7 million more of dead cap space onto your roster. So you're not getting younger and you're not getting cheaper by doing it. The Giants have to figure something out with Darren Waller to keep him here at a lower number somehow, some way. Because if he gets released or he plays at a $15 million number, we're just going to look at this in week 6 when he pulls his hamstring and say, how are we allocating $15 million to a guy that consistently is not on the field?
Oh, of course. Yeah, and that's what the problem is right now, right? And again, that idea of good money after bad. You say dead cap hit. They have 10 million in dead cap coming in with Leonard Williams here. Joe Schoen doesn't want to add more onto it. Now, if he's healthy for this season, we know he can be productive. We know how good he can be when he's on the field. But what is the trade-off if he does go down in week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6? If he only plays half of this upcoming season, then it's still going to feel just as painful that now you'll get off the money eventually, but it's still going to feel bad that you have that money occupied. We talked about, depending on where you look, 21 to 26 million in cap room for the Giants, decisions they can make about a Glowinski, maybe about a Slayton, move that money towards 35 and 40 million. Okay. But if you had 55 million in cap space, now you're talking about being one of the top 5 or 6 teams. Now you're talking about the decision you want to make on Saquon Barkley becoming a little bit easier, or on Xavier McKinney, right? When you think about what the Giants have to decide internally before going to free agency, it becomes really hard. We highlighted, you said Robert Hunt, right? Excellent, right? I said, go look at Bryce Huff from the Jets. Guess what? If you didn't have Darren Waller on this roster right now, it would help facilitate getting those 2 players and keeping McKinney and keeping Saquon Barkley and being able to provide for your draft class that's going to be coming in. So that's why I think these decisions are so critical over the first 2 years. And you've said this a couple of times this offseason on the back end of the year, that first year, man, that going to the playoffs and winning a playoff game, whether they thought it going in or not, Joe Schoen, the entire organization was like, "Ooh, let me just get a taste of that Kool-Aid because that seems refreshing." And it may have thrown them off, and it could end up costing them another year of their ultimate rebuild process.
Yeah, it does set back the clock unless they can find the old form, and we're going to need this most recent draft class, which we haven't even talked about. Which I think we should just
Yeah.
run down very quickly in terms of whether or not they're going to be contributors on a playoff team, or whether they're going to have a new coach and GM at the end of the year that they're trying to get a second contract from.
Yeah, 100%. So when we go in, and by the way, I was just so jacked up on what we were talking about with the past offseason, I almost blew right past the draft class. Deonte Banks, first round pick, ends the season with an injury, but we think is a hit. Going to be a great player on the outside, can play man to man, love it. Center John Michael Schmitz. Listen, I'm willing to wait and see, but obviously the pedigree that we thought getting arguably the best center in the draft class had his struggles early. I want to attribute that to total chaos on the offensive line. Jalen Hyatt, question mark. Now that could be mostly predicated on the Giants and the scheme and finding ways to get him involved sooner. And then Eric Gray obviously is just a total enigma, late round draft pick. But when we think about those top three picks, top three, first 3 rounds of the draft class, you have a hit in Banks, and then as of right now, and then it's okay after one year, but you would say question marks for the other two positions, even if they flash things in 2023.
So here's where I stand on this, and I'll be very
Trey
brief.
Hawkins also, you could throw him in there if you want.
Yeah, Trey Hawkins, a lot of talk during training camp, and then within a couple of games ended up getting benched. Obviously, the moment was a little too big for him. He needs a little bit more seasoning, which is fine. That's what happens with late round picks. Here, Adam, we're seeing a trend. Evan Neal performed so poorly. I mentioned a 44, then a 39. He's going backwards. He regressed in 2023. Look at John Michael Schmitz. He was also a can't miss prospect, just like Evan Neal. And guess what? A funny thing happened. John Michael Schmitz had a 41 Pro Football Focus rating, was injured, gave up 5 sacks at the center position, which is like unheard of.
Yeah.
When the pressure's coming right up the middle. Here's my big thing. Either we are just horrific at offensive line talent evaluation, or the change from Bobby Johnson to Carmen Brasillo needs to start paying dividends. Because but when you think about it, Andrew Thomas was not drafted by this regime. So while he did develop, I don't necessarily give them credit for what has happened. It feels like Andrew Thomas was part of the Gettleman regime. So he that's what DG gets credit for. But you look at McCathan, you look at Azudu, you look at Evan Neal, you look at John Michael Schmitz, you look at all of these players. They all have regressed from what their draft position was or what they were thought of coming into the league. And either it has to be coaching or it has to be talent evaluation. Either they weren't good enough and they saw the wrong traits, or we need someone that can coach them up to get the right things out of them. So for me, a lot of this hinges on whether or not Carmen Brasillo can turn things around in the offensive line. Because if he does, he makes a whole lot of people look very, very smart. And he also helps us evaluate the talent across the entire offense. All of a sudden, there's more time to throw it deep to Jalen Hyatt. All of a sudden, the Darren Waller maybe can get open over the middle because you don't have to keep as many tight ends in to be blocking all the time. There's so many things that get impacted by even some of these coaching changes that to me, it feels like it's a little bit of a question mark until we know whether or not it's the players or the coaching that has really hindered the offensive line.
And by the way, that's okay, right? Like it's okay for that to be the case here. It's okay to look at this as being we are in talent evaluation right now for a lot of the young players on this roster. What won't feel okay is if we rewind it back and say McCathan's a miss, Azudu is a miss, Cordell Flott doesn't cement himself in that role, right? Other players that you bring in this past off season through the draft class, you need Schmitz to figure this out. Otherwise, that's going to be an absolute nightmare scenario for this line. You need Jalen Hyatt to be a hit if you're thinking about moving on from Darius Slayton in the near future, right? So all of these things, it's like they're all right there. And if they go, the fork to the left, hey, guess what? The foundation is sound. Even if we move on from Daniel Jones, fork a little bit to the right. And now we're talking about, well, talk to me in 2025 and let's see where we're at. And by the way, at that point, we could be saying, where are we at with our new GM, with our new head coach, and the new direction of this franchise? One last note that I will say, just because I've harped on me personally, not Andy as well necessarily, the Darren Waller signing. When you go back and just look at that draft class, in and around pick 100, Trey Tucker, he went to the Raiders, so effectively that was the pick. He had 19 catches for 331 yards and 2 touchdowns this past season as a rookie. So you can certainly look at that and say, hey, that could have been a player for us. But when you see offensive linemen like Saldiveri, you had a DB and Kylie Ringo, Freeland, Andrews. Ringo played for the Eagles, obviously, this past season. 16 solo tackles, a 64.5 PFF. Outside of that, nobody right around there really popped off, right? So you can paint the picture of, was the value going to be there in the draft or not? That makes it worth the risk. And this is probably some of the behind the scenes stuff that we aren't privy to, right? Where is our draft board? Is this guy going to offer value? How young do we want to go? What stability, upside, all that different kind of stuff that we hope that Joe Schoen is doing a better job with. But if we look back at this now, let's tie a bow on 2023. I put the draft class right now. I mean, I would say massive incomplete at best, right? And I think that's as far as you can go after one season rookie year. But the offseason, I mean, I feel like maybe I'm going to be more generous than you. I said C plus, understanding you had a glaring miss in Paris Campbell and you failed to retain what could have been a hit in Jamison Crowder. But Bobby Okereke almost gets me all the way across the line just because of the stability that he brought to the linebacker corps.
I'm relatively similar to you. I'm not going to be
Okay.
too overly critical about it because we did think Paris Campbell would be good based on the scheme that they wanted to
We
do,
were
his
excited at the
speed
time. We were excited.
and how they intended to utilize him. I'm like, yeah, I'm all in. I get what you guys are trying to do, and it fails miserably. And so, what I don't know whether it was the execution, whether it was the evaluation, if it could work. To me, I'm kind of sitting at a C. Maybe I'll give a C plus because of Bobby Okereke. It feels like, you can't give him a B minus because there were so many whiffs
Yeah.
across like some of the different signings. But you know what? I'll give him a C plus because Ashawn Robinson and Nunez Roche allowed Joe Schoen to trade Leonard Williams, as I mentioned before. And you know what? You kind of mentioned the draft class. Tough to understand after 1 year whether Eric Gray is going to be a contributor or Trey Hawkins. You hope Jordan Riley maybe can emerge and be
Yes.
that
Yes.
defensive
Left him
line
out.
help
Yeah.
later in the draft. So incomplete right now. Kind of looks like a C plus, could move into a B or B minus, B plus if some of these guys emerge. So really kind of a mixed bag so far in the offseason, which is why this one's so important upcoming for Joe Schoen.
Yep. And when you finally have money to work with, now this is where the rubber meets the road. So it looks like we say off-season to draft class the last 2 years, incremental, maybe some steps forward here, not as many picks in 2023 as he had the year prior. Riley, a good one for you to mention there, obviously, as well. But now you have money, and now you have the draft class, and now you have the extra second round pick. So Joe Schoen is on the hot seat in terms of having a kind of a home run off season. And we won't know until we get into the reps and we're talking in weeks 2, 3, and 4. But he needs to find some real hits throughout the first, multiple second and third rounds of this draft class if we want to believe that the base is strong for this team. That being the case, guys, coming up next, we are going to have discussions about some potential combine players to watch, right? Where are we on our positions? Where do we have some needs? Andy right now is cultivating a wide receiver list that is going to just knock your socks off. So you get over to YouTube and you get us at One Giant Podcast, obviously, wherever your podcast needs fulfilled, at Andy Mac 214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast over on Twitter. We remind you, hop on over to Manscaped, use our exclusive promo code OGP24 for 20% off and free shipping on your order. And yes, friends, we are a little greedy here. We also want to tell you that if you're feeling a little down not being a part of the playoffs, go over to pietential.com, Pietential. They have an exclusive online assessment tool, basically a survey that sets benchmarks for your well-being, tracks your progress, and gives you tools to improve. It's really a nice little way to make sure that you're moving through 2024 at a great clip. Andy, wow, what a journey. Until next time, as you would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.